you very much to Mike for having this conversation. Okay, cool. Hello again. Thanks very much to anyone who listened to the first episode of the Models Are Wrong podcast. I hope you really enjoyed it. We're back again, just the two of us now, to just have a little discussion between us, kind of reflecting on what we learnt and what we heard from Mike, and just to add our thoughts. Basically, there are a few things that we wanted to touch on again, basically. But first, a really big thank you to Mike for doing the podcast. I had a really interesting chat.
Yeah, it was really... I found it very refreshing. Never have really had a discussion like that with someone in that space before, and I don't think that really you hear it as PhD students. You don't really hear that conversation being had, so hopefully we've been able to facilitate that. I certainly really found it very helpful. Some of the things he talked about in terms of media and his relationship with the media, that was really, really interesting, as well as that anecdote about Matt Keeling. That was a highlight for me personally.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, it was also really refreshing to have someone talk about the what interdisciplinary research can actually mean in practice, and in particular how that, in combination with how modelling is used in something practical, some decision making, something like this, policy decisions, all of that, just the interface between academia, these quite abstract models that we ourselves and PhD students and researchers spend their time working on, and the real world essentially, and how everybody else feels the impact.
Yeah, I think it's a point that epidemiology probably is further along in the pipeline in terms of interdisciplinarity. As Mike said, he's had to, for a decade or two, work with people from other disciplines. I think that epidemiology in particular is probably, has made more developments in that than some of the other applied maths fields. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops. Maybe there's stuff that we can learn from epidemiology in other applied maths fields to sort of speed up that process and make it a bit more smooth.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that it's not to say that there aren't other fields which are developed in that way. I think epidemiology, we spoke to Mike and he was saying, well, that to his knowledge at least, 2001 was really the first time that that mathematical modelling in epidemiology was applied directly in policy decision making. Not that maths hasn't entered epidemiology before 2001, of course it has, but in that specific sphere. And that obviously maths, in the way that it's interacted with engineering and physics, is much older than that, very well established, these kinds of things. But it's the fact that when you enter a new field, when mathematical modelling enters a new field, there are a whole different set of issues. It's not that you take what you learned from engineering in terms of interdisciplinarity and working in a practical domain, and you just apply everything you learned from that to a new field, and that's like fantastic, we're done. There are a whole new set of problems. So it's nice to have to learn something from a sort of 20-year, quite young period, and see how that works. Because, maybe it's worth mentioning just an example of another field which we feel like maths is like tiptoeing into or being used quite a lot, but it's still younger than epidemiology.
Yeah, so one thing that one space that we've noticed growing is maths in the social sciences. We've seen quite a lot of opinion dynamics, modelling opinions and seeing sort of social media networks, thinking about how information spreads through social media networks. And that certainly is something that's very young. maybe 5 years tops.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's going to be very interesting to see how they wrestle with those problems that epidemiology had, that Mike was talking about, in particular with foot and mouth, for example. As you said, you can't just sort of copy and paste those mitigations that epidemiology has perhaps found and perhaps not found. But yeah, so it's going to be really interesting. There's going to be some really nice work, I think, in trying to overcome those barriers that we're talking about with interdisciplinarity, specifically in maths and social sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's like certain sets of that interdisciplinary relationship have kind of been not quick to overcome necessarily, but that maths modelling is useful in this regime is unquestionable. We know that Google, Facebook, these organisations are using to some degree. Maybe I'm touching on computational modelling, perhaps, as opposed to mathematical modelling.
Also, you have to question useful for whom.
Well, absolutely, but this is what I'm saying, is it's like it's useful to someone to use maths in this new domain. Yes. So to that degree, the interdisciplinary nature is there, but it's like it's not developed in the way that the ethical implications, or exactly who is this serving, mathematical models in social sciences, who is this serving currently, and for what? So
just to put it more bluntly, if you sort of are using these mathematical models to try and maximize the time that someone spends on a social media, then that is useful, of course, for the company, the social media company, but it's not necessarily useful for the public or society in wider.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe let's just pick up on a couple of other things that we mentioned and touched on in the podcast that we might like to go into a bit more. So one thing that we picked up on watching the conversation back, was there was some difficulty in getting a clear understanding of how SPI-M works internally. There are a few things that Mike couldn't tell us, quite a few things that Mike couldn't tell us, and a couple of things that Mike didn't know. That at the time, it sort of, we're like, that's fine. I mean, partly, we didn't want to push,
No.
and
Mike was very good for giving us his time, so
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And he was very clear on
what he could and couldn't say.
So, but kind of in retrospect, we're thinking, is it reasonable that those things are unknowable for us, the public, or even unknowable to Mike as a member of SPI-M?
I think that possibly the answer to that is no. I don't think it is reasonable. I think that, of course, there are going to be things that cannot be said, especially if you're talking about more defence sorts of things. It's very understandable. We hear a lot about things that can't be told to the public. We just have to sort of trust the people in charge. You may or may not say now that, it's become clear that we cannot trust the people in charge to do those things. So I would suggest that more transparency is good. And I don't really see why. Certainly it should be clear to the scientist.
I think it should, the huge difference it makes, knowing the motivations of who you're working for, or the motivation of the role of the research that you're doing, or the model that you produce, how that is going to be interpreted by whom, and amalgamated into a decision. In a way, there is an argument that, you're the modeler, you're supposed to create something objective, which then people who are then through democracy, they're voted in to make the decisions for the public. But, one thing, this sort of ties in with something Mike said about the optimal control thing. The idea that the modelers were supposed to produce models for decision making based on certain amounts of lockdown, this kind of thing. And he pointed out that, the optimal thing to do if you're trying to reduce the amount of COVID that is spreading, and that is your only goal, is lockdown entirely and forever.
Yes.
And then you have no COVID.
Then you have no COVID.
Yeah. Whereas he was going, well, in reality, of course, we are trading off COVID with economic impact and the impact on the health of everybody else's life, mental health and otherwise. So you've got to think about how you're going to trade these off optimally. And to know that is how that is going to be traded off in what way would definitely influence how you create the model in the first place, what you put into it, I would expect.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think it's very... I don't see you being able to do anything really useful without interacting with the people in the other fields. For example, economics. And scientists do get pilloried for that. We've seen it in the media and on the comment sections. People saying that scientists have no touch with reality, for example, in terms of these models. And how can you expect them to do so if you are not allowing some sort of cross-fertilization between the two, between the many fields that are working on this at the same time. So the transparency, yes, there's, as we were talking about with the communication with the media, communication with the public, communication with policymakers, there's also transparency between scientists, transparency between scientists and the public, and then also transparency between the scientists and the politicians. And those three different levels, presumably, I can only presume, I don't see why they wouldn't require very different skill sets on behalf of everyone involved. They would require very different institutions to handle it, very different platforms to relay that communication, and it doesn't seem like that from the public's point of view. I don't think, certainly not from my view, that those things are in place.
I agree, and a case from the podcast again. Mike was talking about the foot and mouth epidemic, with 9 lines on the graph at the level of the scientist model. This is what they produced. Then that got cut down to 3, which at the next level of decision making, which then got cut down to 1, which got given to Tony Blair for the ultimate decision. Now, if there was transparency about what the decision making process was going to be, all of the scientists would have thrown their arms up in horror and gone, we cannot, this is worse than useless to produce this and give this to Tony Blair. This cannot be how this works. Just boycott if it was me. Now, and I think that touches on just, you have to make the case for transparency, because there is a case on the other side, and one of the cases is, there's not just the concern that things are being done, let's say, immorally, like, I don't know, giving contracts to your mates or whatever. There's also just the seeing that things are being done incompetently or badly. I would say that would be an example where the communication process from the scientists to the politicians is incompetent. It doesn't work. And you could make an argument that is in some way that making that opaque is kind of an immoral thing to do, in that probably you probably assume that the reason for that is that you want to cover your back in case you are doing things stupidly. You don't want to be seen to be doing something stupid.
Yeah, it's about preventing accountability, isn't it? If we were able to see exactly how the decisions were made and who was making the decisions, and why they were making the decisions, and any vested interests, and also lack of qualifications, then you would actually be able to hold someone at least, or a group of people, or an institution, or anything, or a company accountable for specific things. And no, it's not that easy to, even if there was full transparency, no, we would not agree wholeheartedly on who was accountable, but you would be further along in that journey, I think, of producing some sort of accountability. And this is something that ties into the inquiry that they're going to come up with. That's about trying to preserve some sort of accountability, trying to kind of portray some sense of accountability, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be able to produce that, or at least I'm skeptical of its ability to do that.
Yeah, certainly. I think you have to be skeptical, particularly when the people who are organising it are the ones who mostly want to escape accountability. You'd have to question that. So I think, on reflection, certainly slightly more sceptical about how reasonable it is that we as the public shouldn't be allowed to know how the internal workings of SPI, what they are, how they work, how they feed into Sage, these kinds of things. And we're not the first to say it.
No.
At all.
I think that probably that might be the biggest thing that's come out of COVID in terms of maybe, moving forward the public consciousness on certain things. I think the public consciousness of transparency has been a big thing, as well as, tying it into other, we don't want to make this completely about epidemiology, just things we mentioned about the applied maths fields, these documentaries about social medias, for example, on Netflix and other streaming sites are available, of course. But they have, I think, moved forward the public consciousness, as I said, which can only be a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I think it basically can only be a good thing. I think, again, just large things that affect your life that you're not allowed to know how they're working because of somebody else's interests.
One thing that I did kind of want to point out was this idea of media training that Mike suggested at the end of the podcast for mitigation of some of these problems that he outlined himself and has experienced himself. And I was just thinking that in some ways that's kind of top of the pyramid of needs. I think that it will be useful, very useful, for a select number of PhD students, and certainly it would make a difference for a select number of PhD students. But it got me thinking: is there something that we can sort of roll out more widely to PhD students that might be more useful in the short and long term for all PhD students? Some sort of communication training, and I'm sure if we asked Mike, he would agree with that. And he was just pointing out from his experience that media training would have been very useful and would be useful for a number of PhD students, which I completely agree with. But some sort of communication training, I think, would be nice for a wide variety of PhD students.
So in our CDT, which is the Centre for Doctoral Training, essentially it's a PhD plus a year previous, which is kind of a taught masters, half taught masters maybe with a project and this kind of thing. Within this, there are 4 streams. I think it's 4. Anyway, however many it is, there's a teaching stream, there's an entrepreneurship stream, I think. There's an outreach stream.
And an industry stream.
I think. This doesn't actually take up this takes up a very marginal amount of our time, I would say, anything that is associated with these streams. But it is an option. The outreach stream is probably the one that is most relevant here. Communication to people who aren't scientists. The education one is essentially teaching undergraduates, right?
Yes.
And
I guess they're all about communication in some sense, but outreach would be more about communication to the public, which is
yes,
what
public and perhaps media.
Yes.
So I don't know what is involved in that stream.
I think that often, in my experience, the outreach events, they tend to be for school kids.
They do
a
seem
lot
to
of
be
it
often.
is, getting kids inspired. Rather than engagement with the public about your research specifically. Yes. It's more about inspiring the public about maths in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's maybe a bit of a mistake, perhaps, to go for the simplest. Often it seems to me that that's like often some very simple maths thing, which is maybe very beautiful in its own right, and you can do something exciting and worthwhile doing this. So I'm not knocking it, but I would expect that there was space for example, even pre-pandemic, if you're an epidemiologist, you might give a talk somewhere, go on a local radio station, something like this, have an interview that was public about the implications of your research, perhaps, and how it interfaces with the real world, not about the nitty-gritty of the maths, which might be very interesting to you and interesting to some people,
to
and you might
of other people.
to a handful of other people, but the implications of something that that is clearly important to many people. I think that could be more useful and perhaps better training for this kind of media stuff.
Yeah, I think that it's just a different. I just think that the outreach stream is not. It's catering to the thing that it's catering to, which is useful in its own right. I just don't think that it addresses this problem of communication with the public at large about things that affect the public.
Yeah. I think that's definitely true, and there are so many. I mean, with just thinking about the research of people in our cohort in the CDT, our years CDT, many of those have elements to them or applications, very direct applications really, that a lot of people would be very interested to hear about, I would guess, because they're important issues. I mean, some people are working on network models which are very directly applicable to social networks, these kinds of things. It's many of them are the techniques that might be used by social networking platforms to calculate various things and that go into their algorithms. Others are working on deep learning and neural networks, various biology type things. I mean, this world of mathematical modelling is shouldn't be seen as so separate from the real world, perhaps.
No, I think that in general it's decreasingly separate from the real world. The more time that we spend online or interacting with digital things, the more data we have, and then therefore the more catered to real life these models can become.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we are seeing more and more companies utilising them for good and for bad. And that needs to be discussed, I think. And as we've been talking about, the scientist who is developing that needs to have some sort of autonomy as to, maybe not autonomy of exactly how it's being used, but autonomy of how the public perceive it, because if they are the first person to address the public about the thing that they are developing, I think that can probably have some sort of difference in the long-term view of it and interaction with it from the public's point of view.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And it's not like people don't... It doesn't have to be, I think, a really high-profile event either to be helpful. I mean, if you can find on YouTube a talk catered for a public audience who are non-experts, given by some of the original researchers about the the social implications they believe that there are of their work, what they would like it to be used for, what they think is a positive use for this. Just to have that out there, I think would make a big difference when, say, some large company gets a hold of it and is using it for X, Y, Z, that we're all a bit like, are we sure we're comfortable with it being used like that? If you have both of those, because at the moment, I don't think I could say that that is the case, that if I go and look for a scientist's view of what they did, what it should be used for in any way, what their thoughts are on that, I don't think it's that easy to find.
No, I don't think it's that easy to find. And further to that, as Mike kind of implied, they're kind of told to stay away from that. You know, he said that story about, just focus on the epidemiology. For goodness sake, Mike, forget about the economy.
Forget about the economy. Forget about the decisions. That's not your role.
You know, how can you on the one hand, have some sort of mechanism that portrays that view to the scientist? You know, he didn't say that he was told that directly, but it was made hard to have that cross-fertilization, and then also say, well, the scientists should be more involved in talking to the public. I don't think that I think that those two things are slightly mutually exclusive. I think that you have to either promote that cross-fertilization with other fields, and that then I think induces some sort of ability on the scientist's behalf, or duty on the scientist's behalf, to then bring that to the public. You can't really, I think that at the moment, neither of them are really well supported or encouraged.
I agree. I think I might strongly second the well supported, maybe less strongly support the encouraged. I think that in words in public face, these things are encouraged. Yes. I mean, I think that widely in CDTs and in academia, if you go on the websites of various groups and universities, the word interdisciplinarity is bandied about constantly. It really is a buzzword, like, artificial intelligence is stamped on everything, interdisciplinarity is stamped on everything. And I'm still, I think it's very reasonable to be sceptical of how much that is actually happening.
Yes, I mean, certainly in my experience, there are lots of barriers to interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary work that are put there seemingly for no good reason. Yes. That exists for perhaps some legacy. Not necessarily someone putting them there, but you're not given the tools to overcome those barriers sufficiently as a scientist.
Yeah, I would definitely support that. Thanks very much for listening to us give our sort of thoughts on the podcast itself. I hope it was a kind of an interesting addition, a useful addition. Do get in contact if you have any feedback. That would be really interesting to hear. And I hope you tune in for the next one.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.